In the echoes of history, the lives of ordinary people often brushed against the extraordinary. While some characters in this story are born from imagination, others, like Augustus, Julius Caesar, and Octavian, are drawn directly from the pages of the past. Together, they create a narrative that blends the real with the fictional, offering a glimpse into what could have happened. Chapter 1. The Streets of Rome. Marcus Felix moved slowly through the crowded streets of Rome, weaving his way past market stalls, children darting through gaps in the crowds, and the steady, jostling masses of people who had come to hear the latest news. He was a scribe, a profession that required a calm demeanor and an eye for detail. But today, even he felt a trace of nervous energy. The year was 29 BCE, and Rome was in the midst of a profound change. Octavian's victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra had swept through the city like a long-awaited storm, leaving in its wake the promise of something new, something uncertain. The streets were thick with people, their tunics and togas brushing against Marcus as he went. He paused for a moment, taking in the city that had been his home for as long as he could remember. The Forum, the beating heart of Roman political life, was thrumming with voices, thick with anticipation. Traders hawked their wares, spices from the east, heavy sacks of grain, and jugs of olive oil, while senators and equestrians huddled in small groups, their heads bent close together as they exchanged hurried, nervous whispers. The air smelled of fresh bread, burnt incense, and the damp stone of ancient buildings. To Marcus's left, the shadow of the Curia Julia loomed, its sturdy Republican architecture a testament to an era that seemed to be fading away before his eyes. He could see the fading paint on the older temples, their columns worn and chipped from generations of reverent hands, but alongside them, construction crews were hard at work. New marble monuments, bright and polished, rose up from the foundations of the old, their white surfaces a sharp contrast to the weathered stones that had stood since the days of the Republic. It was as if the city itself was struggling to decide whether to cling to its past or embrace a future that was still uncertain. Marcus's destination was the heart of the Forum, where a temporary platform had been erected, draped in red and purple fabric. Here, Octavian, the man who had restored order after years of brutal civil war, would soon speak to the people. Marcus had been hired to record every word. The work was simple enough, and yet he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. His role was to listen, to observe, and to preserve each utterance for posterity, but he couldn't help but wonder how much of that history would be altered in the retelling. In Rome, after all, words were as much about power as they were about truth. The crowd thickened as he drew closer to the stage, pressing Marcus from all sides. He caught glimpses of familiar faces, the grocer who sold him figs, the elderly merchant who never failed to wave from his stall, and the stern senator who lived a few streets away, his face etched with the same deep lines of worry that seemed to shadow everyone in the city. It was a strange time, full of hope and fear in equal measure. The civil wars had brought Rome to the brink of ruin, and now the people looked to Octavian, not just as a victor, but as a potential savior. When Marcus finally reached the edge of the platform, he could see Octavian standing nearby, his figure framed against the backdrop of Rome's hills, bathed in the pale autumn sunlight. The man who would soon be known as Augustus was lean and young, his features sharp and composed, with the unmistakable confidence of someone who had not just survived the chaos of the past decade, but mastered it. He wore a toga that shimmered in the light, each fold precisely draped, and his eyes moved steadily across the gathered faces with a calm that belied the careful calculation beneath. The crowd fell into a hush as Octavian began to speak. His voice was clear and steady, carrying easily over the heads of the assembled Romans. He spoke of peace, pax, the kind of peace that only he, with his unmatched victories, could bring. He spoke of Rome's greatness, promising to restore it to the glory of its past while leading it to a prosperous future. Each word was deliberate, each phrase designed to evoke both a sense of pride and a sense of duty. Marcus's stylus moved rapidly over the wax tablet in his hand, capturing the rhythm of Octavian's speech, the careful rise and fall of his words. Around him, the crowd was silent, caught between hope and skepticism. These were the same people who had seen the Republic torn apart, who had witnessed the bloody proscriptions of Sulla and the violent ambitions of Julius Caesar. Now, they listened to a man who spoke of unity, promising an end to the endless cycle of power struggles that had plagued them for years. He would be their restorer of peace, their princeps, a first among equals. Though Marcus wondered how many truly believed in the notion of equality anymore. As the speech concluded, a ripple of applause spread through the crowd, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Octavian acknowledged the cheers with a measured nod, his expression remaining impassive. Marcus lowered his tablet and took a long breath, the tension easing from his shoulders. He had done his job. Every word had been captured, every sentiment preserved. Yet as he stood there, watching Octavian descend the steps to greet the senators who waited below, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing the end of something as much as the beginning. Rome was changing, its streets a strange mixture of the familiar and the new, and as he turned to make his way back through the crowded forum, Marcus knew that the city would never be quite the same again. Chapter 2: The Rise of Augustus. The transformation of Rome began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the months following Octavian's return from the East. Marcus Felix watched the city change day by day from his new position within Augustus's administrative offices, tucked away in the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill. It was a time of rebuilding, a time when the dust of the past seemed to settle even as the foundations of a new order were being laid. Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, had won a war, but more importantly, he was winning a peace. The Senate had granted him a host of titles that were as much symbolic as they were practical. Princeps, they called him, first citizen, a term that suggested leadership without dominance, even though everyone knew that true power now rested solely in his hands. In his speeches, Augustus spoke often of clementia, of mercy and the restoration of order, carefully crafting the image of a ruler who had saved Rome from itself. Marcus was tasked with recording these speeches, committing each turn of phrase and careful gesture to the archives. It was not only words that Augustus used to solidify his rule. In the heart of the city, temples were being restored, their facades polished and gilded, standing as proud markers of a renewed devotion to the gods. Augustus himself oversaw the construction of new structures, the gleaming temple of Mars Ultor, promised long before his final victory at Actium, and the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, rising gracefully from its foundations like a promise cast in stone. Each project was laden with meaning, and Marcus saw firsthand how the emperor's architects and artists crafted these monuments to embody the ideals of order, stability, and above all, peace. Rome itself began to reflect Augustus's vision, a city of clean white marble, a city of broad, orderly avenues. The chaos of the civil wars was erased, replaced by buildings that stood as statements of permanence and grandeur. The Forum, once a turbulent hub of political feuds, now seemed subdued, its activity carefully managed. The Senate House, the Curia, was more crowded than ever, yet the discussions held within were quieter, more restrained. Senators still debated and offered counsel, but the days of fierce oratory battles, of rival factions vying openly for dominance, seemed to be fading. Augustus listened to them, consulted them, and honored their traditions. but everyone knew that he alone held the reins of power. The games of the Republic were being played in the shadow of a new reality. Marcus saw the transformation from his small office overlooking the gardens of the imperial residence. His duties had changed. No longer merely a recorder of speeches, he now found himself immersed in the vast machinery of administration that Augustus had begun to assemble. He wrote letters to provincial governors, drafted legal edicts, and watched as tax reforms and new laws slowly tightened the threads of Augustus's control across the sprawling empire. It was subtle, methodical work, and Marcus had to admit a certain admiration for its precision. There was no hint of tyranny, no sign of a dictator's iron fist, only a calm, relentless order spreading from Rome to its furthest reaches. Part of that order came from the army. Augustus had learned well from the chaos of civil strife. Rome's future depended on discipline, on loyalty, and on strength. He began to consolidate the legions, reducing their numbers while making them more efficient. Veterans were rewarded with land in Italy or settled in new colonies across the provinces, where they could carry the values of Rome into distant lands. Marcus was given a glimpse of the meticulous care with which Augustus handled these men, ensuring that their loyalty lay not with ambitious generals, but with the state, his state. Propaganda, too, became a tool of remarkable potency. Coins bearing Augustus's likeness circulated from Spain to Syria, proclaiming his divine favor and his role as the bringer of peace. Poems and stories, funded by the emperor's vast network of patrons, celebrated his achievements, framing his rule as the natural and destined outcome of Rome's turbulent history. Marcus could see how the narratives were spun and reinforced, how the past was subtly rewritten, shaped by the careful hands of historians and poets who owed their fortunes to Augustus's generosity. Despite the careful control of the narrative, Augustus was a man who understood the power of appearances. He lived simply, or so it was said, wearing modest clothes and eating the simplest foods. Yet Marcus knew that this humility was as much a part of the emperor's strategy as the grand temples and statues. He was careful to show himself as the shepherd of Rome, a ruler who held power not for his own glory, but for the glory of the city. To many, this modesty only made his power more absolute, his authority more difficult to challenge. The day the Arapacis was unveiled, Marcus was there, standing among the crowd that had gathered to witness the ceremony. The altar, surrounded by intricate carvings of the goddess Pax and the bounty of a peaceful world, was a vision of beauty and calm. It was a symbol that Augustus's rule had not just ended the civil wars, but had ushered in a new era, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For Marcus, it was a moment that crystallized everything he had seen. The old republic giving way to something new, something that promised to be stronger, if only because it was more carefully, more skillfully controlled. Rome felt different now, its streets cleaner, its buildings brighter, its citizens more subdued. The markets were less chaotic, the temples more frequented, and the forum no longer echoed with the angry shouts of rival factions. It was as if the whole city had taken a breath, pausing after years of turmoil to consider what it might become. And in the heart of it all was Augustus, guiding Rome with a steady hand, his every move echoing with the promise of stability, even as the power of the old Senate faded into the background. Yet Marcus could not shake a sense of disquiet. He was a Roman, raised in the traditions of the Republic, and though he admired Augustus's wisdom, he knew that what had been lost could never truly return. The civil wars were over, but the price of peace had been a kind of silence, a quiet submission that lay over the city like a fine dust, visible only to those who remembered what it had been like before. As Marcus returned to his duties that day, leaving behind the newly consecrated altar, he could not help but wonder what the future held. Augustus had promised peace, and perhaps he had delivered it. But the cost of that peace was still unfolding, like the slow construction of a monument that would one day stand as a testament to a world that had chosen order over freedom. Chapter 3. The Age of Stability, Pax Romana begins. Rome stood at the dawn of a new age, the turmoil of recent decades fading like the receding echoes of a long-forgotten storm. With Augustus in control, the city no longer feared the knife of a political rival in the streets or the march of legions through the countryside. The Pax Romana had begun, and Marcus Felix could see its effects not only in the transformed heart of Rome, but across the vast reaches of the empire. Marcus had risen to a modest yet steady position within the imperial administration, now responsible for tax records and the smooth flow of revenue from Rome's provinces. It was a role that suited his diligent nature, one that carried him beyond the familiar streets of the capital and into the furthest corners of an empire that stretched from the dusty shores of Hispania to the cold, windswept banks of the Danube. He traveled by carriage along the newly constructed roads, their stones smooth and precisely fitted, every mile marker a testament to Augustus's ambition. These roads were lifelines, connecting distant provinces to the center of power, ensuring that trade, taxes, and soldiers could move with a speed that would have been unimaginable only a generation before. The provinces were thriving. Marcus saw it in the bustling marketplaces of Gaul, where Roman traders sold exotic goods from the east alongside local produce. He observed it in the newly founded colonies, where veterans of Augustus's legions had settled, bringing with them Roman customs, laws, and the quiet confidence of men who had fought for and been rewarded by the emperor. In cities like Lugdunum and Tarraco, the benefits of Rome's rule were evident. Stone buildings rose where wooden huts once stood, and Latin, the language of administration and commerce, was becoming the common tongue. In the towns and cities, aqueducts carried fresh water over hills and valleys, their graceful arches a sign that Rome's technology, and by extension, Rome's authority, was here to stay. Marcus was often struck by the sheer scale of it all. He stood beneath the great aqueduct at Nemausus, feeling the cool mist of water as it splashed through the channels above, and marveled at the ingenuity that brought life to these remote places. The construction of roads and aqueducts, temples, and forums was more than mere civic improvement. It was Rome's promise that peace and order would endure. Yet, the Pax Romana was not without its challenges. In his duties, Marcus saw the complexities of governance as he handled ledgers and documents that detailed the flow of goods and taxes, the price of grain, the allocation of funds for public works. He saw how Rome's economy had grown, its prosperity tied to the steady, reliable income from its provinces. Silver mines in Hispania and agricultural estates in Egypt's fertile Nile Delta filled the coffers of the empire, feeding its ambitions and securing its borders. But with prosperity came new pressures, the demands of tax collectors, the burden of military service, and the ever-present expectation of loyalty to the emperor. In the countryside, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Local customs clashed with Roman law, and not all provincial leaders accepted the benefits of Roman rule without resentment. In Gaul, Marcus witnessed the remnants of old tribes, their leaders cautious in dealing with Roman officials, eager to maintain some vestige of their former independence. In Judea, the streets of Jerusalem were filled with wary eyes, and the whispers of unrest filtered through the marketplaces. Even in these moments of tension, however, Augustus's rule remained unshaken, buttressed by a formidable network of loyal governors and an army whose discipline was beyond question. Back in Rome, the city gleamed with a new vitality. The old slums were replaced with orderly streets and wide public spaces, dominated by shining temples and imposing forums. The great baths, thermae, became places where citizens of all classes gathered, basking in the warmth of heated water or debating politics and philosophy in shaded courtyards. Marcus had grown used to the rhythm of his new life, spending his mornings in the marble offices of the Palatine Hill and his afternoons traversing the city's new plazas, where statues of Augustus stood tall, their faces stern and serene, projecting an image of timeless authority. The emperor himself remained a distant figure, more a symbol than a man, yet his influence touched every aspect of life. In Rome, the people knew Augustus as a restorer. He had rebuilt the temples and expanded the forum, funded games and festivals that dazzled the crowds, and offered grain distributions that kept the lower classes content. To many, he was a man of almost mythical proportions, the guardian of Roman virtues who had brought stability and peace after the dark years of civil war. The sense of security that Augustus fostered was palpable. Merchants from Alexandria and Carthage docked in Ostia's crowded port, their ships heavy with spices, silks, and fine pottery. Artisans worked in shops along the Via Sacra, their goods displayed in colorful stalls under the bright Mediterranean sun. Life seemed predictable again, and for the first time in a long while, people felt safe. They talked of Rome's future with hope, imagining a world without the fear of sudden upheaval or the specter of foreign invaders. Children played in the streets while their parents gathered in the shade of newly planted trees, gossiping about the latest rumors from the imperial court. Yet Marcus knew that this peace was delicate. He had seen the records. He knew how carefully Augustus balanced the interests of the army, the provinces, and the Senate. The emperor's power rested on a fragile network of alliances and the unspoken agreement that he would maintain Rome's greatness without descending into the tyranny of a dictator. Each day, Marcus wrote letters to distant governors and finalized documents that bore the emperor's seal, understanding that every word carried weight. Every number in his ledgers was more than a figure. It was a promise of continued prosperity. As his work took him from one province to another, Marcus grew accustomed to the rhythm of empire. He traveled by ship along the coastlines of Africa, by horse across the flat expanses of the German frontier, and on foot through the sun-scorched deserts of Syria. He met merchants and soldiers, provincial governors and local magistrates, all bound by the thin thread of Roman control. In the marketplaces of Antioch, he heard stories of eastern lands, of distant kings and great cities that lay beyond the reach of Rome. In the hills of Dalmatia, he saw new colonies rising, their streets laid out with the same precision as the ones he knew in the capital. The years passed, and Rome became a city of marble and brick, its streets more crowded than ever, its temples busier with offerings to gods who had watched over the city for centuries. Marcus could see the stability that Augustus had promised, and he felt the cautious optimism that seemed to permeate the air, an optimism born from years of peace and growing prosperity. Yet he knew, as did many others, that this peace was unlike the old days of the Republic. It was something different, something managed and controlled. As he sat in his office one evening, the sunlight streaming through the narrow window, illuminating the scrolls piled high on his desk, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of the Republic his father had spoken of, the fierce debates in the Senate, the freedom to speak one's mind, the ambition that had driven men to greatness and, sometimes, to ruin. He thought of Augustus, now an older man, but still the steady hand guiding the empire, his image carved in stone across the city and beyond. The Pax Romana had begun, and it was clear to Marcus that Rome's future lay not in the wild dreams of the Republic, but in the careful, measured order that Augustus had brought. It was a different kind of greatness, perhaps not as bold or as free, but it was enduring, and that, in the end, might be enough. Chapter 4. The Imperial Family and Succession Struggles. The imperial household was a world of marble halls, whispered rumors, and veiled intentions, a far cry from the bustling streets and open spaces where Rome's citizens celebrated Augustus as the father of their newfound peace. From his position as a minor administrator, Marcus Felix had seen the empire grow strong under Augustus's watchful eye. But now his duties had shifted. He was no longer just an observer of Rome's public affairs. He had become, quietly, a recorder of the private intrigues that swirled around the emperor's court. Augustus had crafted his power with careful precision, but the question of succession had become an ever-present shadow, one that grew darker with each passing year. The emperor was aging, his hair now gray, his once vigorous step slower, and the city watched anxiously as he sought to secure a future that would not unravel in his absence. Rome had known the chaos of transition before. Marcus had heard the stories of Julius Caesar's assassination, of the bloody wars that followed, of the Republic's collapse, and no one wished to see that turmoil return. Augustus had to find a successor, someone who could carry forward his legacy of order without splintering the empire he had so carefully constructed. The emperor's first choice had been his nephew, Marcellus, a bright, handsome youth whose promise seemed boundless. But fate had been cruel. Marcellus had died young, leaving the hopes of Rome in mourning and Augustus's plans in disarray. Marcus remembered the tense silence that settled over the court in those days, the whispered condolences, the furtive looks exchanged between senators as they speculated about who might rise to fill the vacuum. There had been others too who seemed fit for the mantle. Gaius and Lucius, Augustus's grandsons, both adopted as sons and groomed to rule. Their portraits were everywhere, smiling down from frescoes in the grand halls, their names celebrated in official decrees. But even these bright hopes were snatched away. Gaius fell to wounds in Armenia. Lucius died of a fever in Gaul. Each loss was a blow not only to Augustus's heart, but to the stability of the empire. Marcus recorded it all, the grief that swept through the palace, the hurried reassignments of power, the reshuffling of Augustus's plans. Rome's future, so carefully secured, was slipping from the emperor's grasp. In this time of uncertainty, Marcus was given new duties. No longer just a scribe of public speeches, he now documented the whispers of the imperial court. Hushed conversations in shadowed corridors, the cautious, guarded meetings between senators, and the private moments of the emperor himself, who had grown increasingly withdrawn. Augustus's household was a theater of ambitions, its actors shifting from favor to disgrace with the slightest change in the emperor's expression. Marcus learned to read the subtleties of those changes. A slight nod from Augustus could elevate a man to power, a cold stare could ruin him. Among the shifting figures of the court, one name stood out: Tiberius. He was a soldier, a man of stern demeanor and precise movements, whose reputation was that of a cold, competent leader. Tiberius had never sought the spotlight, yet now he seemed the only candidate left who could preserve what Augustus had built. Marcus watched as Augustus, with weary determination, began to shape Tiberius into his heir. It was not an easy transformation. Tiberius had withdrawn from politics once before, seeking solace on the island of Rhodes, far from Rome's intrigues. But Augustus had called him back, insisting that duty outweighed personal desires. The years of civil war had taught Augustus that a ruler did not have the luxury of choosing peace for himself. Publicly, Augustus presented Tiberius as a loyal son, a man who would follow in his footsteps and uphold the values of Rome. But in private, Marcus saw the tensions. He saw how Tiberius's eyes narrowed when Augustus spoke of his grandsons, how he remained silent when the conversation turned to the future. There were rumors, too. Rumors of Augustus's manipulations, of quiet bargains struck behind closed doors, of alliances made and unmade in the dead of night. In Rome, even the emperor's family was not immune to suspicion, and Marcus knew that each decision Augustus made carried the weight of 100 unspoken consequences. As Tiberius was gradually brought into the center of power, Marcus saw Augustus's hand in everything. The slow, deliberate transfer of authority, the public honors that signaled Tiberius's growing importance, the careful balance of praise and restraint. Augustus had ruled with a mask of humility, and now he was teaching Tiberius the same lessons. The art of appearing reluctant even as power settled into his grasp. Statues of Tiberius began to appear across the city, his stern features captured in white marble, always standing a step behind Augustus, as if to suggest continuity without ambition. The city was watching. Rome's citizens, who had once cheered Augustus as the restorer of order, now watched the imperial family with a wary curiosity. They saw the honors heaped upon Tiberius, the triumphs celebrated for his military victories, the consular powers granted to him by a Senate that had long since ceased to be an independent body, and wondered if the old wounds of ambition and rivalry were beginning to reopen. In the markets, whispers grew louder. Tiberius was not loved, not the way Augustus had been. He was respected, feared even, but affection was something harder to command. Marcus heard these rumors and dutifully recorded them, knowing that Augustus's private eyes would scrutinize every word. The emperor's determination to secure his dynasty reached a peak one autumn afternoon when Augustus summoned Marcus to the palace. It was rare to be called so close to the emperor's private chambers, and Marcus moved through the corridors with a mixture of dread and fascination. He was to document a family gathering, a moment of reconciliation, Augustus had insisted. The room was small, lined with tapestries that muffled the sounds of the city beyond. Augustus sat at the head of the table, his face thin and tired, but his eyes still sharp. Tiberius was there, silent and stiff, along with the other members of the imperial family, each playing their part in a tableau of unity that felt more brittle than real. Augustus spoke at length about duty, about the legacy of Rome and the necessity of sacrifice. He praised Tiberius's loyalty, his competence, his strength. Yet there was an undercurrent of urgency in his words, a hint of desperation that Marcus had never heard before. It was as if the emperor knew that no amount of ceremony or careful planning could guarantee the future he desired. As the meeting ended, Marcus caught a fleeting glimpse of Tiberius's face, a mask of impassivity, betrayed only by the tension in his jaw. In the months that followed, Augustus's health began to decline. Marcus watched as Rome held its breath, the streets quieter, the people subdued. There were no grand declarations, no sudden changes of law or policy. Augustus continued to rule, but his presence seemed diminished, as if he were already half a memory. The city's attention shifted more and more to Tiberius, who now carried the weight of command with the same stern determination that had marked his military career. Augustus's guidance faded into the background, and it was clear to all that the transition was underway. The end came quietly. In the heat of late summer, when Augustus's body finally gave out and the city plunged into a silence that felt like the pause between breaths. Tiberius was declared emperor, his power solidified not by the enthusiastic cheers of the populace, but by the weary acceptance of a city that had grown accustomed to the reign of one man. Marcus, as ever, recorded the official proclamations, the speeches, the public mourning, knowing that history would see these documents as the story of a smooth, inevitable transition. But Marcus knew better. He had seen the fear, the doubt, the constant, weary struggle to maintain control. He had seen the cost of peace, how it had transformed Augustus from a young, hopeful leader into a man burdened by secrets and the weight of his own ambition. The stability of Rome had come at a price, and it was one that the city would carry into the uncertain future. The Julian bloodline remained, but the dreams of the old republic were buried beneath the marble palaces of the imperial family, where ambition and caution had danced a careful dance in the twilight of Augustus's reign. Chapter 5: The Building of the Roman Empire. The expansion of Rome's borders was as steady and relentless as the rise of the morning sun. Under Augustus's careful direction, what had begun as a fractured republic now stretched across a vast expanse of lands, each newly conquered territory brought under the banner of Roman law and order. The empire had become a network of interconnected provinces, and Marcus Felix found himself at the center of that web, no longer just a keeper of records, but now a participant in the great project of empire building. It was the autumn of his career, and he had been assigned to a diplomatic mission to Gaul, an opportunity to witness firsthand the transformation that Roman rule had brought to the outer reaches of the empire. Marcus's journey began in Rome, where the sense of stability and prosperity had settled over the city like a warm cloak. The broad avenues and marble forums, the newly completed theaters and temples, stood as symbols of a peace that had been hard-won and carefully maintained. The streets were safer now, patrolled by the vigilant vigils, and the docks at Ostia were alive with ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. There was a palpable sense of optimism, a feeling that Rome's golden age had only just begun. His ship set sail from Ostia with the late summer breeze, the decks laden with goods bound for the northern provinces, amphorae filled with olive oil and wine, crates of fine textiles, and baskets of spices. The mission was more than a diplomatic exercise. It was a statement of Rome's confidence, a show of wealth and power that would cement alliances and remind the recently subdued Gallic tribes of the benefits of Roman civilization. The Mediterranean sparkled beneath the ship's prow, and Marcus could feel the gentle rocking of the waves beneath his feet as they made their way along the coastlines of Hispania, past rugged cliffs and sandy beaches that had only recently come fully under Rome's dominion. When they disembarked in the bustling port of Massilia, Marcus was struck by the mingling of cultures that greeted him. The streets were lined with Roman-style villas, their tiled roofs gleaming in the sunlight, but alongside them stood older houses with pointed Gallic roofs and wooden shutters. The city had become a blend of Roman and local, a place where Latin mixed freely with the native languages and where Gauls in Roman togas mingled with merchants from the eastern provinces. It was a microcosm of the empire itself, diverse, vibrant, and yet unmistakably Roman. In Gaul, the marks of conquest were everywhere, yet they were softened by the passage of time. The legions had subdued the tribes years ago, but Augustus's rule had brought something more enduring than military might. Roads, wide and straight, cut through the thick forests and rolling hills, connecting the old tribal centers to Roman garrisons and newly established towns. Marcus traveled along the Via Agrippa, a great highway that sliced north through the heart of the province, built by Augustus's most trusted generals to facilitate the movement of goods, troops, and information. The roads were more than a means of transportation. They were a physical manifestation of Rome's reach, a constant reminder of the empire's presence. The Romans brought more than roads, however. In every town Marcus visited, he saw the signs of integration, aqueducts that brought fresh water to towns where only rivers had flowed before, public baths where local chiefs now relaxed alongside Roman officials, and new temples dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, their columns rising proudly above the tiled roofs of Gallic houses. Roman engineers had transformed the landscape, taming wild rivers and constructing bridges that spanned valleys once impassable. In the fields, Roman agricultural techniques were being adopted, leading to higher yields and an increase in wealth that was visible in the bustling markets and the prosperity of the provincial elites. Yet the process of Romanization was not without its challenges. Marcus sat in countless meetings with local leaders, whose respect for Roman authority was often tempered by a fierce pride in their own traditions. He witnessed negotiations in which Roman governors, draped in the dignitas of their togas, offered the promise of protection and wealth in exchange for loyalty, while Gallic chieftains, with their thick mustaches and bronze jewelry, insisted on maintaining their ancient customs. The Latin language was spreading, carried by soldiers and merchants, yet the old tongues persisted, spoken quietly in the countryside, where Roman influence was still thin. Marcus, scribbling notes in his journal, recognized the subtle tension that lay beneath the surface, the delicate balance between assimilation and autonomy that Augustus had carefully encouraged. He saw this blend of cultures in the great gatherings of Gaul, where Roman festivals were celebrated with a distinctly local flavor. In Lugdunum, where Marcus's diplomatic mission was headquartered, the governor held games in honor of Augustus, featuring gladiators, theatrical performances, and chariot races. Yet the chariots were driven by local men, their wheels painted in the bright colors of Gallic clans, and the songs that echoed in the arena were a mix of Roman victory hymns and ancient tribal chants. It was a strange harmony, neither wholly Roman nor fully Gallic, but something in between, a new identity that was being forged in the fires of conquest and compromise. Marcus found himself impressed by the resilience of the local culture, even as he marveled at the spread of Roman customs. He was especially taken with the markets of Narbo Martius, where traders from Rome haggled with Gauls over silverware, pottery, and spices. He saw olive oil from Hispania and wheat from Sicily being traded for Gallic wine and wool, and he understood how Rome's economy was becoming a web that linked distant regions in a network of mutual dependency. The benefits of the Pax Romana were clear. The roads were safe, the trade routes secure, and wealth flowed from the provinces back to the capital, enriching the empire as a whole. His journey took him even further north, to the windswept lands near the Rhine, where the line between Roman civilization and the untamed wilderness was sharply drawn. Here, Roman forts marked the frontier, their walls thick and imposing, garrisoned by soldiers who spoke of home with a wistful longing. Marcus watched as they drilled, their armor gleaming in the harsh northern light, and he knew that the stability Rome enjoyed was not merely a gift. It was maintained by the watchful eyes and sharp swords of men like these. The barbarians beyond the frontier, the tribes that had not yet been pacified, loomed as a reminder of the dangers that always lay at the empire's edges. Returning to Rome months later, Marcus felt the change in himself as he walked the familiar streets. He had seen the empire, not as a distant abstraction, but as a living, breathing organism, a mosaic of peoples and cultures bound together by the Pax Romana. The forum seemed more bustling than ever, filled with traders and petitioners, officials and citizens, all conducting their business under the watchful eye of Augustus's statues. The shops were fuller, the temples busier, and the people more content. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a confidence that Rome had not merely survived its past, but had become something greater, a force that could shape the world. Marcus settled back into his role, recording the day-to-day administration of an empire that was thriving under Augustus's guiding hand. He documented the emperor's latest projects, new colonies in the east, land reforms in Italia, and the continued construction of public works that had transformed the city itself into a masterpiece of urban planning. He knew that Augustus's reign was more than just a political achievement. It was a cultural and economic revolution that had changed the very fabric of Roman society. Yet, for all its grandeur, Marcus never forgot the small moments, the conversations with Gallic traders, the sight of Roman children playing games in provincial towns, the farmers who now worked Roman fields with tools that bore the marks of both their heritage and their conquerors. The Pax Romana had brought prosperity, stability, and a sense of common identity, but it was not a single, monolithic force. It was, instead, 1,000 small adaptations, a careful blend of the old and the new, a dance of power and culture that had created a world where the name of Rome meant something to peoples who had once fought against it. As he sat in his study, surrounded by scrolls and maps of the provinces, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction. He had seen the Roman Empire not only as an idea, but as a reality, lived and breathed by millions. Augustus had brought them peace, and though it was a peace that required vigilance, Marcus knew it was a peace worth preserving. Rome was no longer merely a city or a collection of provinces. It was an empire, united by law, language, and the promise of order. It was a world that had been built stone by stone, law by law, and Marcus had witnessed its making. Chapter 6: The Dark Side of the Empire. Life under the Emperors. Rome had become a city of contrasts, its streets gleaming with the brilliance of imperial prosperity, while shadows grew longer in the corners where the true price of that greatness was paid. Marcus Felix, who had once looked upon Augustus's reign with clear-eyed admiration, now found himself drawn into the murkier depths of Roman society. He had seen the triumphs, the marble monuments, and the wide roads of the Pax Romana. Now, he was beginning to see what lay beneath them, an empire whose splendor was built upon the backs of those who had little hope of sharing in its glory. His friendship with Flavius began by chance, one damp evening at a small tavern near the Suburra, Rome's bustling working-class district. Marcus had come there to escape the weight of his administrative duties, to find a quiet corner away from the polished offices of the imperial palace. Flavius, a former slave who had purchased his freedom years before, was seated at a nearby table, his voice rising above the din as he haggled with a trader over a shipment of olive oil from Sicily. They struck up a conversation, and Marcus found himself captivated by the man's sharp wit and shrewd observations about the city they both called home. Flavius spoke plainly, with none of the cautious diplomacy that Marcus had grown accustomed to at court, and it was refreshing. Flavius had been born into slavery, his early years spent in a wealthy Roman household, where he had served as a tutor for the children of the family. He spoke Latin with the precision of a scholar and had a keen mind for numbers, a skill that had caught the attention of his master, who eventually allowed him to manage the household's finances. It was a strange kind of freedom, the ability to handle great sums of wealth while owning nothing himself. But Flavius had been clever, saving every bit of money he could earn until he had enough to buy his freedom. Now, as a merchant, he moved among the lower ranks of Rome's traders, carrying goods through the city's narrow streets and navigating the complexities of Roman commerce with a savvy earned through years of survival. Through Flavius's stories, Marcus came to understand the harsh realities of life under the empire, the cruelty and indifference that lay behind Rome's grandeur. There were hundreds of thousands like Flavius, men and women who toiled in silence, their labor unseen but essential. Slaves built the roads that stretched from one end of the empire to the other, toiled in the quarries that supplied marble for the emperor's projects, and served in the grand villas of the elite, tending to their every need. They cooked, cleaned, farmed, and even fought as gladiators in the Colosseum, where the spectacle of their bloodshed was disguised as entertainment for Rome's masses. Marcus began to notice the slaves more keenly. their bowed heads as they passed through the crowded streets, the way they slipped silently into the shadows when their masters spoke, their tired eyes averted from the bright light of Augustus's golden city. The divide between Rome's elite and its underclass was stark and unforgiving. Marcus, who had once moved easily among the marble columns and polished floors of the imperial offices, now felt the discomfort of wealth every time he passed a street vendor selling stale bread or a beggar crouched beneath the porticos. He was a man of the middle ranks, neither wealthy nor poor, but the lavish excesses of Rome's high society were impossible to ignore. In the great estates that lined the Palatine Hill, senators and wealthy merchants hosted endless banquets, their tables laden with exotic dishes from the far reaches of the empire. Peacocks stuffed with dates, oysters from Britannia, and wines spiced with eastern herbs. Marcus found himself at one such gathering, watching in silence as a senator's wife discarded half-eaten platters to the floor, her laughter mingling with the music of a dozen flutes. He felt for the first time a sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. Public life in Rome was a pageant of wealth and power, and nowhere was that more evident than in the gladiatorial games. Marcus had attended them often, at first with a sense of detached curiosity, then with a growing discomfort. In the Flavian amphitheater, the crowds roared as men fought for their lives, the sand stained red with their blood, their struggles watched with the same casual interest as the afternoon races. Augustus himself was careful to keep the games controlled. He disapproved of the excesses of past generations, and the spectacles he sponsored were a balance of discipline and grandeur, meant to remind the people of Rome's might and the generosity of the emperor who fed and entertained them. But to Marcus, the cheers of the crowd felt hollow, a reminder that beneath the veneer of peace lay an empire sustained by violence. As Flavius's business prospered, Marcus spent more time in the lower districts, where Rome's plebeians lived in crowded insulae, tall apartment buildings that leaned precariously over narrow alleyways. It was a world far removed from the orderly avenues and public baths of the city's center. Here, the smells of cooking fires, unwashed bodies, and refuse hung heavy in the air, and the noise was a constant hum of chatter, arguments, and street vendors calling out to passersby. These were the people who felt the weight of the emperor's taxes, who struggled to afford the grain distributed by the state, and who lived in constant fear of fires that could sweep through their wooden dwellings in moments. They were Romans, but their lives were as different from those of the elite as the night was from day. Flavius spoke often of the injustices he saw: the wealthy who exploited the poor, the tax collectors who skimmed from the revenues they gathered, the magistrates who could be bribed to overlook any crime if the payment was right. Marcus listened, his mind turning back to the ideals of the Republic he had studied in his youth, the concepts of justice and civic duty that now seemed so far removed from the realities of the empire. Augustus, the man he had once revered, had brought stability, but that stability came with a heavy price. The rigid social hierarchy that kept the lower classes in their place, the executions that silenced dissent, the laws that favored the wealthy over the poor. He began to question the tales of Roman virtue that he had been taught. Augustus was not a tyrant. Marcus knew that well enough. The emperor ruled with a calm, paternal hand, and he had never indulged in the cruelty that had marked the reigns of other leaders. But he was not above the ruthless measures that kept his power intact. Marcus had heard of the political executions, the whispered warnings from colleagues to avoid certain names, the disappearances of men who had spoken too freely. He saw the quiet fear that gripped Rome's senators when Augustus passed judgment, his eyes narrowing with a calculating stare that could seal a man's fate with a single nod. The ideals of Roman justice and fairness, the grand speeches of the Forum that spoke of honor and duty, now seemed hollow, drowned out by the reality of an empire that maintained its order through force and control. Marcus found himself increasingly silent in the imperial offices, the cheerful bustle of administrative work growing harder to bear. He continued to write his reports, to draft the decrees that would govern the provinces and collect the taxes that would fund Rome's luxuries. But the passion had gone out of it. He felt as if he were recording the movements of a vast machine, a mechanism that ground on relentlessly, indifferent to the lives caught within its gears. One night, he sat with Flavius on the steps of a modest house in the Subura, watching the lights of the wealthy villas twinkle on the hills above. They spoke of Rome's future, of the hope that the empire might grow beyond its rigid hierarchies, that justice might be more than a word carved on the walls of the Senate house. Flavius, with a wry smile, told him that change would come only when men like Marcus, men with power and position, chose to see the empire as it truly was. "Rome is great," Flavius said, his voice calm but firm, "but it's not perfect. Not yet. Maybe it never will be." Marcus could find no answer to that. He stared out into the dark streets, feeling the weight of his doubts pressing down on him. Augustus's Rome was a city of order and stability, but also of quiet oppression, of people who lived and died beneath the shining surface without ever glimpsing the grandeur that others took for granted. It was the Pax Romana, a time of peace that had come with a price. Marcus had once thought that price worth paying. Now, he was no longer so sure. Chapter 7. The Legacy of Augustus and the Rise of the Good Emperors. Augustus was gone, his body entombed in the grand mausoleum he had built for himself on the field of Mars, and Rome was left to grapple with the legacy of the man who had turned a fragile republic into an indomitable empire. Marcus Felix was older now, his hair touched with gray and his steps slower, but his mind remained sharp, recording the passing years with the diligence of a man who had seen the best and worst of Rome. The city he loved had changed yet again, shifting to accommodate new rulers and new challenges, but the foundations Augustus had laid endured, holding Rome together even as the old certainties gave way to fresh uncertainties. Tiberius, Augustus's reluctant heir, was the first to take the throne. A soldier by training and a man of few words, he had none of his predecessor's charisma, but all of his cunning. Tiberius ruled from a distance, often absent from Rome, preferring the rocky cliffs of Capri to the marble splendor of the Palatine. Marcus, now deeply entrenched in the city's intellectual circles, watched the political atmosphere grow colder, more secretive. The Senate, once the stage for grand speeches and fierce debates, had become a body that moved in cautious silence, every word measured, every opinion guarded. The empire remained stable, but there was a creeping sense of unease, a fear that Tiberius's watchful eye extended even into the hearts of men. Marcus recorded the subtle shift in the city's tone, noting the way Tiberius wielded the instruments of power, his spies and informants, his control over the military, his manipulation of the grain supply that fed the populace. The economy remained strong thanks to Augustus's careful management, and the roads, aqueducts, and infrastructure continued to flourish, but there was a sense that Rome had lost something essential, a vibrancy replaced by the dark currents of imperial control. The true test of Augustus's legacy, however, came with the rise of Caligula, whose brief and turbulent reign nearly undid the stability that Rome had come to depend on. Marcus, now in his 50s, looked on with horror as the young emperor, mad with power, squandered the wealth of the empire on lavish feasts and bizarre spectacles. He decreed temples to himself, demanded worship as a living god, and indulged in excesses that turned the city's murmurs of discontent into open terror. Marcus recorded it all, The stories of Caligula's cruelty, the sudden executions, the paranoia that spread through the upper echelons of Roman society like a disease. The empire, it seemed, teetered on the brink of collapse, but Rome endured. After Caligula's assassination, Marcus watched with cautious optimism as the unlikeliest of rulers, the scholar emperor Claudius, took the throne. Claudius, underestimated by all, proved to be a diligent, capable administrator. Marcus, now writing not just as a scribe but as a historian, chronicled Claudius's efforts to repair the damage wrought by his predecessor. Roads were extended into Britannia, new ports were constructed, and the imperial bureaucracy was reformed, making it more efficient and far-reaching than ever before. The shadows of Tiberius and Caligula faded, replaced by a sense of quiet progress. Rome's prosperity, however, would again be tested by the reign of Nero, a man whose rule began with promise but ended in flames. Marcus watched from a distance as the young Nero, once hailed as a patron of the arts, descended into tyranny, his paranoia leading to the purges of rivals and whispers of conspiracies that never seemed to end. When the great fire of Rome swept through the city, devouring entire districts in a torrent of heat and smoke, Marcus stood on a hill outside the city, the glow of the flames casting eerie shadows across his face, knowing that Rome's darkest days had returned. The fire was blamed on Christians, an obscure sect whose members were rounded up and executed in the brutal games that followed, their deaths a grim spectacle that Marcus recorded with a heavy heart. And yet, as always, the city rebuilt itself. Marcus watched the rubble cleared away, the great buildings rise once more, and he could not help but marvel at Rome's resilience, at the way the empire absorbed every blow and found a way to endure. He chronicled the fall of Nero, the bloody chaos that followed, and the eventual rise of a new line of emperors, the Flavians, who stabilized the empire after years of misrule. But it was not until the dawn of the 2nd century, with the reign of the 5 good emperors, that Marcus saw a true resurgence of the spirit that Augustus had kindled so long ago. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, each emperor built upon the foundations laid by Augustus, bringing new life to an empire that had survived so many trials. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Germania. And Marcus noted the revival of public works, the construction of vast forums and triumphal arches, the roads that now seemed to reach the ends of the earth. Under Hadrian, the borders were consolidated, fortifications strengthened, and the empire's infrastructure expanded with a precision that Augustus himself would have admired. Marcus, now an old man, marveled at the monuments of these new emperors, their names etched in stone alongside the man who had set Rome on its imperial course. Yet Marcus's writings also carried a tone of nostalgia, a longing for the Rome of his youth. The empire was strong, stronger perhaps than it had ever been, but it was different. Augustus had ruled as a careful balance, blending the traditions of the Republic with the absolute power of an emperor, his careful diplomacy and modest demeanor, giving way to a legacy of autocrats whose rule was increasingly marked by power plays and excess. The Senate, once an institution of great dignity, was now a mere advisory body, its members appointed rather than elected, their influence diminished by the authority of the emperor. The Pax Romana had continued, its benefits clear in the prosperity of the provinces, the flourishing of trade, and the stability of the borders. But Marcus could not ignore the cost, the oppression that remained, the sense that freedom had been sacrificed for order, that the city's vibrancy had been tamed in exchange for peace. Augustus's reforms had transformed Rome, but they had also set it on a path where stability mattered more than freedom, where the will of one man could determine the fate of millions. Marcus's final years were spent in a modest villa on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by scrolls, his ink-stained hands growing arthritic with age. He continued to write, recording not only the deeds of emperors, but the life of the people, the merchants who traded in the bustling markets, the builders who erected the temples and aqueducts, the soldiers who guarded the frontiers, and the slaves who remained the invisible backbone of Rome's greatness. He wrote with a sense of urgency, knowing that his memories and observations would become part of Rome's history, that his words might someday be read by others who would never know the world he had seen. As he sat one evening, gazing out at the familiar skyline of Rome, the city bathed in the golden light of dusk, he thought of Augustus, the man he had once served, the ruler who had shaped his entire life. The emperor's image was everywhere, from the coins that bore his likeness to the statues that lined the streets. But to Marcus, Augustus was more than just a symbol. He was a reminder of the complexities of power, the compromises that held empires together, and the price of building something meant to last. The empire would endure for centuries yet, Marcus knew, strengthened by the reforms of Augustus and guided by the hands of capable rulers. It would rise and fall, suffer defeats, and achieve glorious victories, but it would remain Rome, an idea as much as a city, a symbol of power and civilization that had conquered not only the lands around it, but the hearts of those who called it home. In Augustus's time, it had been a world reborn. Now it was a world solidified, a testament to the strength and fragility of human ambition. As the last light faded from the sky, Marcus dipped his quill one final time and wrote the closing lines of his history. It was the story of Rome, but also the story of a man who had witnessed it all, who had seen the city rise from the chaos of civil war to the heights of empire, who had watched as the ideals of a republic gave way to the grandeur of an emperor's vision. 1000%. It was a story that would never truly end, as long as Rome remained. Chapter 8. The Rise of Trajan and the Peak of the Empire. Rome, under the rule of Emperor Trajan, reached the pinnacle of its power, its empire expanding to the farthest limits ever imagined. The streets of the Eternal City were alive with the bustle of commerce and the confident stride of a people who knew they were at the heart of the world's greatest empire. The reign of Augustus, the man who had laid the foundations for Rome's future, had transformed the city from a war-torn republic into a powerful and stable empire. Now, Trajan's leadership represented the culmination of that transformation, a moment when the strength and grandeur of Rome seemed unassailable. Trajan was a ruler who brought Rome to its zenith, embodying the virtues of a soldier and statesman. Unlike his predecessors, he was no reluctant emperor. He embraced power with a quiet confidence that endeared him to the Senate, the legions, and the people alike. His campaigns into Dacia had secured vast new territories for Rome and filled the imperial treasury with the spoils of war. Gold and silver from the newly conquered lands flooded into the capital, igniting a wave of construction that reshaped the city. Monuments, markets, and temples sprung up across Rome, financed by the wealth of conquest and the emperor's ambition. The crowning achievement of Trajan's architectural legacy was the vast forum that bore his name, a marvel of engineering and design that dwarfed even the grand public spaces of Augustus. In its center stood Trajan's Column, a towering marble monument that spiraled skyward, its surface covered with intricate reliefs chronicling the emperor's victories in Dacia. The column was not merely a record of war, but a symbol of the might and sophistication of the Roman state, a declaration that Rome's power extended far beyond its ancient walls, now encompassing territories from Britannia's windswept shores to the deserts of Parthia. The empire had never been so vast, so wealthy, or so secure. Augustus's careful consolidation of power had created the stability needed for expansion, and his administrative reforms had turned Rome's chaotic collection of territories into a coherent and functioning empire. Now, under Trajan's confident leadership, those foundations allowed Rome to stretch its borders to their furthest extent, bringing distant provinces into the fold and cementing Roman culture across an increasingly diverse population. In the heart of the empire, the city of Rome gleamed with prosperity. Newly constructed markets thrived with goods from every corner of the known world: Egyptian grain, Eastern spices, British tin, Gallic wine, and African ivory. Traders and merchants bustled through the crowded streets, speaking dozens of languages, all united by the common thread of Latin. The city's ports, from the busy docks of Ostia to the smaller harbors along the Tiber, saw a constant flow of ships laden with goods, testament to the stability of the Pax Romana that Augustus had promised and Trajan had delivered. The benefits of that peace were visible in every aspect of life. Roads extended in all directions from the city like the spokes of a wheel, straight and well-maintained, their smooth stones a testament to Rome's engineering prowess. These roads connected the far-flung corners of the empire, making it possible for soldiers to march swiftly, for merchants to carry their wares safely, and for information to travel quickly. Beneath the streets, aqueducts carried fresh water into the heart of the city, feeding the great public baths, the fountains that adorned every plaza, and the villas of the wealthy. Trajan's reign was not merely about conquest. He was an emperor who understood the power of building as well as of war. His public works projects were not limited to Rome. They extended across the empire. New cities were founded in the provinces, and older settlements were Romanized, adopting the infrastructure, language, and customs of the capital. Bridges spanned mighty rivers in Germania, harbors were expanded along the coast of Africa, and grand forums were built in provincial capitals, all modeled after those of Rome. In these places, the benefits of Roman rule were clear: protection, prosperity, and a sense of order that had replaced the chaos of independent tribes and rival kingdoms. Roman citizenship became a sought-after status, granting rights and privileges to those who had once been enemies of the empire. In the provinces, Latin became the language of law and commerce, its smooth, practical phrases spreading from military camps to city squares. Temples to Roman gods stood alongside local shrines, blending religious traditions in a way that strengthened rather than divided. Roman culture, its art, its architecture, its laws, became a unifying force, allowing the empire's diverse peoples to see themselves as part of a greater whole. Yet this expansion came at a cost. Trajan's wars, while glorious, had stretched the empire's resources to their limits. The conquests of Dacia had not only brought wealth, but had also led to depopulation and the forced movement of tribes, leaving scars that would not easily heal. The vast new borders of the empire required constant vigilance. Roman legions were now stationed in distant lands, garrisoned along the Rhine and the Danube, holding back the restless barbarian tribes who still tested the empire's strength. The soldiers who guarded these frontiers were the backbone of Roman power, but their loyalty had to be carefully maintained, their pay and rewards guaranteed. Despite these challenges, Trajan's reign was a time of relative peace and prosperity, a golden age that in many ways vindicated Augustus's vision. The administrative reforms, the infrastructure projects, and the legal foundations Augustus had established were what allowed Trajan to govern effectively, even as the empire reached its greatest extent. Augustus had taught Rome how to manage power with restraint, and that lesson was evident in Trajan's policies, which balanced ambition with pragmatism. Trajan was hailed as Optimus Princeps, the best ruler, by a Senate that had long since given up its independence for stability. The old republican ideals were still honored in name. But the reality was that Rome was now a monarchy in all but title, its rulers wielding power that was absolute but not unchecked. The bureaucracy that Augustus had created had become a permanent fixture, a mechanism that kept the vast empire running smoothly despite the whims of its leaders. As the years passed, the city of Rome continued to grow, its population swelling with immigrants from every part of the empire. It was a city of contrasts, where marble temples and grand forums stood alongside the cramped and chaotic neighborhoods of the poor. Yet there was a sense of unity that had not existed before, an understanding that to be Roman was to belong to something greater, something enduring. The empire was not just a collection of lands and peoples, it was a shared culture, a shared identity that transcended borders. The completion of Trajan's column was a fitting symbol of Rome's peak, a marker of a time when the empire had reached its furthest boundaries and stood as the dominant power of the known world. Carved in exquisite detail, the column depicted not only the triumphs of war, but the complexity of empire, the building of bridges, the construction of forts, the negotiations with foreign leaders. It was a story in stone of a civilization that had grown from a small city on the Tiber into a force that shaped the lives of millions. Rome, under Trajan, was at its height, a city of power and culture, its name synonymous with civilization itself. The empire Augustus had founded had become the greatest the world had ever seen, and it seemed for a time that nothing could challenge its might. But the seeds of Rome's future were already being sown in the soil of its greatest successes, and the empire, like all things, would one day face its decline. For now, however, Rome was eternal, its streets alive with the hum of prosperity, its legions guarding a frontier that stretched as far as the eye could see, and its monuments, those silent witnesses of history, standing tall under the clear blue skies of the Mediterranean. The story of Rome was not over, but it had reached a moment of triumph, a moment that would be remembered for centuries to come as the peak of a civilization that had mastered the world.